My name is John Mitchell, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the ODI and the launch of the long-awaited ALNAP Guide to Evaluating Humanitarian Action. And I'd like to also welcome our online participants from around the world. I understand that we have nearly or over 500 people registered for the event, which must be something of a record, so welcome to you all. I hope you can see me, I hope you can hear me clearly, and you'll have an opportunity to pose questions on the online chat room later in the session. But before we get going, let's let me alert you to a few housekeeping points. Please, can everybody, if they haven't done so already, please turn your phones on to silent. The event is on record, and so please feel free to tweet. The event hashtag is #EHAGuide, and the Wi-Fi code is on the screen there and there. And I understand there will, I hope I'm right in this, there will be some refreshments afterwards, and so you're all very, very welcome to join us afterwards for that. So, this is a very important day for ALNAP, and one that we've been looking forward to for some time. This is the first really comprehensive guide to evaluating humanitarian action, and seeing it here today is a really great feeling for all of us here in ALNAP. You know, it's taken nearly 6 years to complete all the research, writing, the piloting and the rewriting, and I hope and I think you will find that it has been worth the wait. The guide that we have now is based not only on high quality theory and best practice, it's also been properly road tested by humanitarian agencies, and so it genuinely reflects first-hand experience. So we're pretty confident that we have a product which has a kind of optimum utility, if I can put it like that. And to make our day even more special, we have a fabulous panel of experts who are going to enlighten us about the burning issues of the day and help us understand more about this thing that we call evaluation. And to this end, I'll be asking them some questions which we've received from many of you in the evaluation community. And you'll understand that we can't cover all the questions that have come our way, so I do apologise to those of you who have submitted questions that we can't address, but I'm confident that we will cover many things, and I'm sure that you'll find much of it in interest. There'll also be a live question and answer discussion here with our audience and also with our online chat room audience as well. So please do hold on to any questions that may emerge in your mind, and we will get onto them later. So let me now turn to our panel. I'll introduce them to you. The most difficult thing for me chairing this meeting is to pronounce the name of the gentleman on my right, so I'm going to give it a go, but I know I'm going to get it hopelessly wrong. It's Mikkel Nielgar. Come on, tell us. Oh, I'll never do that. I'll never do that. But anyway, Mikkel is the head of monitoring and evaluation advisor at the Danish Refugee Council. He's over 10 years of experience in conducting evaluations and assessment in conflict-prone countries such as Afghanistan, Kosovo, Central African Republic, and Southern Sudan. And his current role is strengthening the use of monitoring and evaluation for learning. And on the far right of the table, we have John Cosgrave, who is an independent consultant and author, one of the joint authors of the EHA Guide. He's based in Ireland. He has 30 years of experience in humanitarian and development endeavours in over 60 countries. So he's very well travelled. And in the past 15 years, he tells us, he's led 37 humanitarian evaluations and participated in another 19. That's 56 in all. You're busy, John. Fairly busy. He was also the evaluation advisor for the Tsunami Evaluation Coalition and co-authored the synthesis report. He's also lead author for the ALNAP Real-Time Evaluation Guide and co-author of ALNAP's evaluation guide, as I said earlier. He's developed a number of specialist tools for evaluation, including an evidence tool that simplifies the recording and analysis of qualitative evaluation information. Maybe you'll tell us more about that later, we'll see. And indeed, I know this for a fact that John is very well known in the evaluation community for assembling and analysing very large data sets. And on my left, we have Margie Buchanan-Smith, who is Senior Research Associate at the ODI and the other joint author of the EHA Guide. And she's based in London, has been involved in the humanitarian sector for over 20 years. And her current focus is Sudan, especially Darfur, where she first worked in the late 1980s, specialising in policy and practice, livelihoods and evaluations. And she's also currently a visiting fellow at the Feinstein International Centre at Tufts University. And of course, it's not down here, but Margie was the previous head of HPG, so welcome back. Sadly, Alison Evans was down to be on the panel with us. She was unable to attend, so she sends her apologies. So before we hear from our fabulous panel, I'm going to ask Alexandra to come up and give us a short summary of what's in the guide. In case you don't know, Alexandra has been centrally involved in the development of the guide over the years and managed many of the moving parts, and there were many moving parts. Alexandra, over to you.
Well, thank you everyone for coming and joining us today for this very exciting day, the launch of the EHA Guide. Like John has said, it's been a long time in the making, so we're very excited. So we started this initiative because we wanted to improve the quality of humanitarian evaluation by offering comprehensive guidance on EHA. We heard from the piloters of the first version that it offered a common language for EHA, and I find this comment a little bit funny. I think it comes from someone in the room, that it is a stick in the ground, clarifying expectations and on what is good practice. So first off, because we have a good amount of people in the room, I do want to do a little test, if that's okay. Can everyone raise their hand, please? Good. Okay. So please keep your hand up if you're familiar with the pilot version of the guide. This version here on the screen. Great. Okay. Keep your hand up if your organization uses the EHA guide. Oh, John. I saw Paul put his hand down. That's wrong. Keep your hand up again still if you yourself have used the EHA guide in evaluations or in training or just as a reference in general. Very good. Okay. Well, I'm very happy to see that we have a lot of fresh faces in the room. I hope you'll be extremely excited about this resource. And you now know who to go annoy during the networking afterwards to ask how they have been using the guide. So I think I can say that the EHA guide is the crown jewel of ALNAP's evaluation work. I'm not shy about that. But it is complemented by our humanitarian evaluation, community of practice, and other research and guidance that we've developed over the years, such as our new guide on the evaluation of protection and humanitarian action, as well as our work on evaluation and utilization. Can I get the... So the guide has a really strong focus on utilization in two ways. Firstly, how do we improve the use of evaluation findings and results? And secondly, how are people actually using this resource? How do we make sure that we're satisfying their needs in terms of the design and layout of the guide? So the final guide is structured to more closely follow the stages of the evaluation process, as you can see up here on the screen. We wanted to develop a resource that was useful to everyone involved in an evaluation process, highlighting specific points of consideration for each person involved. So, for instance, evaluation commissioners, I think you'll be quite happy to see our more in-depth section on TORs. Evaluation stakeholders, we have new tools on how to pick good evaluation questions. And evaluation managers, I think you'll be particularly keen on our new breakdown or further breakdown on inception reports. And of course, our dear evaluators in the room, you'll likely enjoy how we restructured the section on designing your evaluation, adding more content on sampling as well as data analysis. So then the final version incorporates many new good practice examples and new resources. If I could get the next slide. However, one message that came back loud and clear from the piloters of the first version of the guide was, but how is EHA actually different? What is unique about this area of evaluation? So we've incorporated a lot more specific tips and ethical considerations for humanitarians. So I hope you're as excited about this resource as we are. For those listening online, you can get the resource after the event. It will be emailed to you. For those in the room, please don't stampede. It is to my right. You can grab one afterwards. In the coming months, we will be translating the guide and having some follow-up events, so keep your eyes peeled. And I do hope that for everyone in the room, you'll be joining us afterwards for some drinks and nibbles to properly celebrate the launch of the guide. So, of course, I can't do an introductory presentation like this without a few thank yous. So, first of all, I have to thank John and Margie, who have been working at this resource tirelessly for many years now. I personally would also like to thank the many people who have been working behind the scenes on this resource. So our communication officer, who's still working away very diligently, Alex Glynn here at the front. We have our research assistant, Sean Cook, over here to the side, and our former colleague, Francesca Bonino. And lastly, we must thank the ALNAP membership for having supported this initiative from the very beginning. It would not have come this far without all of their help. Special thanks go to the members of the drafting advisory group, the piloters, and those core piloters that helped us validate the feedback that we received. I can truly say that thanks to all of their help, we've made the EHA guide not simply an ALNAP Secretariat resource, but a resource from the whole of the ALNAP membership. Great.
And thank you to Alexandra, of course, too. Now we're going to turn to our panel, and we're going to ask Mikhail now to talk about an old perennial for the evaluation community, the utilization of EHA. So, Mikhail, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. And first of all, thank you very much for having me here today, and congratulations on the guide. I feel a little bit lucky sitting here since I was not really part of writing the guide. So I guess I represent a user of the guide, and also a user and manager of evaluations, of course, in the Danish Refugee Council where I work. So, I'm happy here to open this discussion on use, which of course has been going on for a long time in evaluation circles, not only in the humanitarian sector. But if you could say one thing about the humanitarian sector in regards to use, we can maybe say that we were maybe late in starting using evaluations, but we were maybe early in starting thinking a lot about use. And the key example there is, of course, the real-time evaluations that have been a common way of evaluating in our sector, that are exactly designed to be adaptive and to look into the complex settings that we work in, and to bring up timely recommendations that could then enable use. So I think, it has been something that's been very much embedded in the way we do evaluations in the humanitarian sector. Still, of course, it's still a concern. It's still a concern for us in the Danish Refugee Council as well, on how to make the most of the relations we do. How do we make the most of the funds that we put into evaluations? And I think the first thing to say there, of course, why is it still a challenge? It's, of course, because use is not something that just happens automatically. We really need to consider the design of the evaluation to maximize the use of the recommendations that come out. And also maybe because I think especially this idea or this logic or this thinking that an evaluation automatically leads to some findings, that leads to some recommendations, that lead into actions that are then picked up, and our programs change. We scale up or we scale down, or improve our programming for the benefits of our beneficiaries. That doesn't really happen always like that. you can say that's maybe a kind of a weak theory of change, if you might use that word. And that's, of course, why we continuously need to consider use and focus on it and try to improve it. And I think there's another element to it is of course, the way change happen in the kind of organizations that we work in. There's a lot of factors involved in making organizational and programmatic change happen. The evaluations can inform, can support, but it's not the only kind of factor there. But to give you, a few examples of how we try to do it in the Danish Refugee Council, I think there's really a lot of good tips in the guide already. So just for me to try to highlight a few of the things that we have picked up in the Danish Refugee Council, especially from the headquarter-led evaluations. One of them is try to really spend a lot of time in engaging our stakeholders. So that's just very basically to make this process around, coming up with the evaluation questions, spend a lot of time on that and just trying to focus a lot on what are the questions that we really want to have answers to in this evaluation. It might sound quite simple, and I guess it is, but I think the whole thing about prioritizing that part of the evaluation process is really a key. And then the next thing is the thing about, considering the timing of the evaluation. There's a certain time during the year in an organization like ours where we are more able to, there's more, opportunity to take in recommendations from evaluations. So there are opportunities during the year where you can kind of say that there's more readiness in the organization to use evaluation findings. So that's another thing that we always try to focus on to ensure the uptake. And then again, I would say, just stressing this, that there are definitely a lot of other factors influencing the use. One thing here is, of course, the quality of the evaluation, which the guide is all about. Other things, of course, external factors that are maybe beyond our control. So there are things here to consider. So then just maybe finally, a few reflections on, how to manage this issue around use, looking from my perspective as a manager in the Danish Refugee Council. I think there's a few things that we can do. One of them, of course, keep the focus on always trying to maximize the use of the evaluations that we actually do commission and do. And then another thing would be maybe to try to be a little bit more modest as well about what changes can the evaluation actually bring about and when. And I think that is a key consideration for us to have. And also the thing about that evaluations cannot drive the change alone, especially if we look at organizational change processes. And then finally, there's this issue about maybe also looking a little bit beyond what you can call the direct or the instrumental use of evaluations. Because I do think there is an awful lot of value in the debates, the dialogue, the disagreement, and all these things that often happen during an evaluation process. But maybe we are not that good at the moment at valuing that, but we tend to focus more on the direct use or what happens with the recommendations. So that's another thing for consideration, at least from my side. So thank you.
Mikhail, thank you very much. I'm very interested to hear this thing about timing with evaluations. When's a good time in Copenhagen to do an evaluation? I mean, seriously.
Just before the summer break.
Before the summer break. Okay.
No, I think it is. If you look at the country level, we have what we call like annual reviews, where we look into our strategies and we kind of re-strategize and replan our programs there. And of course, to have the evaluations inform that particular event is important. Okay. But I think more what I'm pointing to is this idea about I don't know if you call it dovetailing, but the thing about that if you have already ongoing change process or organizational change process that have the attention of the senior management, and you can kind of build some of your evaluations into that, then you have an opportunity to have a larger impact and larger use, as I see it.
Let me pick up one point that you made, if I may. It's you mentioned the word quality, the quality of the evaluation, and I wondered, in your experience, is there a relationship between the quality of the evaluation and the way that it's used? Maybe after you maybe could comment on that, I'll turn to John and Margie. You have a long experience with evaluations, and I do wonder whether quality and utility are related. What do you think, Mikael?
I think they are. You know, I definitely think they are. I think that you will always have these discussions on the findings or recommendations that are brought forward, and if there isn't a solid evidence, so to speak, behind it or solid method, then this is going to be picked up as well. That's at least in my experience. So I think you need to kind of set it on a solid ground. But I think what I'm trying to highlight is that there's a lot of other influencing factors in this mix, but quality is definitely an important one.
Well, that's reassuring to hear. John, is he right?
He's right, yes. I would say the quality is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for utilization. A poor quality evaluation is easily discredited by attacks on the quality, because when people don't like the message, the first thing they start doing is attacking the method. So necessary but not sufficient, I think, for utilization.
You concur, Margie?
I totally concur.
Okay.
And actually, just to say very quickly, there's actually quite a nice model in the guide that shows what we've identified as some of the key factors affecting utilisation. So there's quality, but there's also actually the human side of interpersonal relations between evaluators and users. And then there's the overall culture of does an organisation have a culture of learning and openness? And is the external context conducive as well?
Yes. I have a question from Annie. Annie Devonport is here somewhere. Annie is just there. Annie, your question, I've actually slightly rephrased it, so tell me if I've messed it up. But you're asking how to make evaluation findings more engaging in order to get them taken up and in order to improve performance. So I assume that you're sort of saying there that maybe evaluation can be a little dry to read.
For me, it's about the reports, actually, and
Right.
how you report.
Right.
Through to the DEC, I'd sometimes be faced.
Just Annie, could
Okay.
Annie, before you go on, could you just say who?
Yes, okay.
I know you don't work for the DEC anymore. But
I
who you
don't.
work-
I'm now independent. But I was the Director of Humanitarian Programmes and Accountability at the Disasters Emergency Committee here in London. So I had the delight of reading a lot of reports, but sometimes also the dismay at looking at something that was 60, 70, 80 pages long. You know, that I was never convinced that a long report necessarily was going to tell me more than something that was concise and sharp and in fewer pages. But even so, I think a long report is not necessarily going to be read by the country officers, not going to be read by the programme officers who are busy doing the doing. So it's about how to get the findings out to the people who are going to be influenced by them, who need to be influenced by them in a more engaging way.
Yes. Mikael, any experiences from your side on the presentation of the results?
Maybe you can even say, the question could be, is there any relation between the report and utilization? Because I think, thinking about utilization, I think it of course has to start a lot before the report. That's just the final documentation, so to speak. So I think what we try to do a lot is kind of to build in feedback sessions like kind of throughout the process. And not that the report is, of course, still very important, but many times, the presentations almost have taken place before it's there. But in terms of innovation, ways of kind of, having a more engaging report, there, I don't have that many more good ideas, except what is already in the report or in the guide in terms of limiting the number of pages and all these things.
John, what about you? You've written a lot of long reports in your time.
I certainly have. And, I'll be talking a little bit about questions, which is one of the ways of answering this. And I will say that the report is not the only fruit. So there are lots of other evaluation products, including debriefings in the field, that are far more effective. And for example, all of you today will have a better memory of the points we raise because you're here than you would have if you just read about it in a paragraph in Humanitarian Exchange or something. So direct feedback in the field, then with the report, shorter briefings and presentations, but also for the report themselves, I think 60 to 80 pages is punishment. And unless you're from a very strong social science background where 120 pages is regarded as fairly normal for an essay, I mean, it's not very good. So what you want in your reports is you want people to use boxes, graphs, illustrations, short little case studies to illustrate the point. It's not to turn it into a tabloid or a newspaper or anything like that, but little vignettes that illustrate the points being made in the report to make the points more memorable for the readers, and also to make the report more interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are quite a lot of interesting innovations happening to try and communicate more engagingly and to help people grasp what are some of the main learnings. And I mean, two that I would highlight. One is, I think, using audiovisual much more. So you may have, because you need to have your evidence there, so you may have something which is a bit heavy and a bit weighty, but you can then do interviews with members of the evaluation team to get the key messages out. I mean, I know some agencies are doing this now, and then putting up little interview clips. And they might be 5 minutes, but people are probably much more likely, and I think agencies are finding that much more likely to listen to those and get the key messages than to read a long report. And the other one, innovation, well, if it's an innovation, but I think the other thing I would want to draw attention to is some agencies are now requesting the evaluators to develop recommendations in consultation with the users. So the findings are pulled together by the evaluation team, but actually making sense of the findings and actually coming up with recommendations is done, collectively with the users. And I think that's a really powerful way of engaging people.
So when you say users?
Users of the evaluation. So, users of the evaluation, so that they're doing the thinking. It's not just the evaluators, but they're doing the thinking as well.
I'm just thinking about this term utilisation. It's a very, very long time ago, but I did many years ago read Michael Quinn Patton's book about utilisation-focused evaluation. And I do remember, John, am I right about this, that there are different sorts of utilisation. We're talking very much about the instrumental kind of use, but there are other, and I can't exactly remember what they were, but I know that they have an effect on policy, the longer term kind of drip kind of changing the policy environment, changing the thinking environment. I mean, can you think of some evaluations that have helped change the way that people think, help change the way the culture of humanitarian thinking in any way? Maybe you've been involved in some yourself.
Well, I would say that the first one is obviously the joint evaluation of Rwanda that led, in fact, to, among other things, the formation of ALNAP. And that's one. More recently, what we now see in the field is that the Tsunami Evaluation Coalition evaluations have had an impact in terms of raising the importance of local control and participation of humanitarian response. So we see a lot more emphasis on that now, because that was one of the main messages from the tsunami evaluations.
Yeah.
So we see that. But that takes a long time to filter through the system.
No, absolutely. I mean, you can see the localization agenda that we're all looking at these days. I mean, you can possibly, if you wanted to, you could see that reflected in the fundamental reorientation recommendation from the tech. Mark, have you got any views about that? Longer term changes, thinking?
I think, yes, I think it is this. I mean, the Rwanda one is the one I would also highlight. And actually, I had the opportunity to do some follow-up work on the Rwanda evaluation, which was actually tracing through how the evaluation was a key influence in the sphere standards being
Yes.
launched.
Yes.
And it was a fascinating process. I hadn't been involved in the Rwanda evaluation,
No.
so in a sense I didn't have any, there was no conflict of interest, but it was a fascinating process to understand what it was
Yeah.
about that evaluation that had such a huge impact on the sector. And I think that was where it was the combination of really good quality. It was a moment in time
Yeah.
when the sector was ready to change, and I think that's also key for utilisation.
Yeah.
And you had very good relations between, and ongoing discussions between the evaluators and some of the kind of key policymakers or
No, absolutely.
innovators in the sector.
You know, ALNAP commissioned a follow-up study to the Rwanda evaluation to have a look at the recommendations that were actually acted upon and taken up. And I can't remember exactly how many recommendations there were, but I think they were certainly well over 100. And if my memory serves me correct, only one of the recommendations was taken up directly, and that actually was the setting up ALNAP. So it's a very important recommendation, obviously. Listen, we'll move on now from utilisation. We may come back to it in the discussion, but I'm going to ask now John Cosgrave to give us a little thumbnail sketch of the importance of asking the right questions in evaluations. John.
Well, it's not just the right questions, it's also few enough questions so you don't end up with a 90-page report. The one message, if you take one message away today, I'd like it to be that when it comes to evaluation questions, less is more. And questions really are one of the main ways in which the evaluation commissioner controls the quality of the evaluation. The other two ways are, of course, setting the approach and scope, and then the team selection criteria. But setting the questions is what really is one of the key determinants of the quality. And the questions drive the type of evaluation that's chosen. For example, they determine whether it's an impact evaluation, a process evaluation, or real-time evaluation. They determine the most appropriate design for the evaluation, or designs, because quite often we use more than one design in any given evaluation. They also determine the methods that can be used, because to answer a particular question, you may need to use a particular method. For example, if you're asked about what proportion of people use the cash grants for education, then that means that you're going to have to use a survey to answer that question. The questions drive the generation of choices in your evaluation matrix, where you decide what method you're going to answer which question. They also drive the budget, because if you have questions that, for example, are going to need a formal survey to answer them, then that's more expensive typically than questions that can be answered through focus groups or key informant interviews. They also influence your sampling choices. I mean, the questions determine whether you need to use random sampling or some sort of targeted sampling. And also, I'm going to say the recommendations. Now, the trouble with 100 recommendations from the Rwanda evaluation is that organizations can only process a few recommendations. Now, I have to hold up my hand and say the very first evaluation I did, I made 42 recommendations, and the unfortunate steering committee nearly fell off their chairs when I did the presentation. That is obvious, and then they asked for them to be prioritized. But the reality is that organizations can only cope administratively with a few recommendations. So the trouble is, if you ask 20 questions, you can't really complain if you get 60 recommendations in response. Now, some agencies have rules limiting the number of questions. For example, at the moment at EU, you can only have 10 questions in your evaluation. I'm going to say that when they started, actually, with the limited number of questions, it was 6, I think, and then it went to 10. ICRC for a while had a rule that an evaluation could only have 2 questions. And if you worked for the Norwegian Refugee Council rather than the Danish Refugee Council, as Mikkel does, if you're doing a field-based or decentralized evaluation, when you're doing your terms of reference, when you try to add in the fourth question, you discover that the software won't let you. So you limit it to 3 questions. And the trouble is that more questions mean more answers, but they also mean more diffuse answers, less well argued, less well researched answers. And when DFID they did a very big study of all their evaluations, and what they found was that in general the evaluations asked too many questions. Now, how many is too many? Well, during the tech, I think we had one of the evaluations, it was circulated. Of course, that's the usual thing. You circulate the terms of reference and ask people, what would you like to know? What would you like to ask? And I think we had, I can't remember whether it was 161 or 261 questions. Now, of course, very sensibly, this was reduced and refined down to sort of, 20 odd key questions, but the evaluation team were asked to bear the others in mind when they were writing their 30-page reports, So I would say that less is more. And what are good questions? Good questions are questions that are central to the objective of the evaluation, can immediately have their answers applied, because, a lot of the time, you can't really take the answer to the question and apply it to the program or the project. Questions that can be answered unequivocally by the evaluation, because of course you have lots of questions, and that from the start you're going to end up with an answer that says, well, on the one hand this, and on the other hand that. And that isn't really, it's nice for contributing to the internal debate, but you really have to ask yourself, was it worth spending all that money to be told on one hand this and on the other hand that? And questions that can only be answered by an evaluation, because there may be other ways to answer your question. It may be an audit is more appropriate, or maybe a limited survey or a staff survey might be better ways of answering than doing an evaluation. Questions that are central to your core mandate. If you're UNICEF and your question is about how much help you've given to the elderly, you really have to question, is that an appropriate question? Is that really that important? And questions that could lead to improvements in the service or reductions in the cost per head, and also questions that would apply to all the stakeholders. Those are good questions. And you can do, I'm going to say that these are my speaking notes. It's called the Evaluation Humanitarian Action Guide, and there is a table on page 112, a tool for looking at your evaluation questions and scoring them to try and pick out the best questions. And the last thing is, of course, that for utilization, you really need to be asking questions that the organization can use the answers to. So that's one of the keys, I think, to utilization.
John, thank you very much. Speaking of questions, I have one here that's just come in from Mike Klein from International Solutions, isn't it, Mike Klein? I'm right, yes, absolutely. Just to make sure I got the name of the organisation right. And he, John, is talking about quality, and I thought it would be an interesting question to ask you now, because at the beginning of your little presentation, you said that the questions were the key ingredient for quality. And so Mike's question is, any tricks by John Cosgrave or the rest of the panel on how to pin down expectations regarding quality at the outset of an evaluation? So is that to do with the questions?
I would say that the best trick is to make sure you have an inception report, because your inception report will help you to see if the team you've selected are up to the job. It'll help you to see if you're asking the right questions. It'll help ensure that everyone in the organization understands what the evaluation is trying to do, because it's not uncommon to get to the end of the evaluation and discover that one part of the organization thought the evaluation was about this and another part thought it was about that. Or even to get, I've had the experience where you go to the field and you discover that the field have a completely different conception. I did one where headquarters said, we're really excited. This is the first time the field has ever asked for an evaluation, like this. So we're really excited. I got to the field, they said, Well, headquarters are really delighted you asked for an evaluation, and the field said, we didn't ask for it, they rang us and told us you were coming. So, Inception report would be my one big
Okay.
tip for quality.
Good, thank you very much. Listen, we have a question from Jose Gillians from the IFRC, who's head of evaluation there at the Federation. And Jose says, evaluation is about getting credible evidence. I keep looking for useful and new methods that support this evidence collection, including ways to report on that evidence. What innovation should we be looking at?
Oh, me again. Okay. I didn't have a single black hair when we started this process 6 years ago. Or, sorry, single white hair when we started this process with Margie 6 years ago. Yeah. If it went on any longer, I wouldn't have any hair at all. Okay, the answer, I think, Joss, is that one thing we are seeing is more and more people in developing countries have smartphones, access to the internet. So I would say that there's nothing new under the sun, but certainly we're seeing a lot more opportunities for big data in the field to help answer some of our evaluation questions. So I would say that that's the big change we're seeing. I don't know, Margie, you commenting?
No, it's fine.
No.
Mikael?
No, I think that's
No?
what we are seeing as well. It's these things of using handheld devices to collect data. It's already happening as I see it
Okay.
in our programs.
We have another follow-up question on this point, which I will put to all of you, and it's someone is asking, how do I convince my boss to use these methods? This person is an evaluation manager and is being pressurized by their boss to use a particular methodology which I don't feel is appropriate. How do I make the case for considering other options? Any?
Can I
Yes,
that?
please do.
I think that there are lots of methods out there, and I think demonstrating how different methods have been used in different contexts. So you may want to scan other evaluations, especially evaluations that are regarded as having been influential, of good quality, and see what methods have been used and make the case. And also pay attention to the context, because in many conflict environments, you see suggestions that there should be some formal quantitative survey done that would depend upon random sampling, and you know that you're going to have very constrained access to large parts of the population. So I think bringing that sense of realism into what can sometimes be quite sort of highfalutin methodological discussions, I think is really important.
Brilliant. Mark, I think we'll stay with you,
Okay.
if we may, and I think you are going to talk about involving affected people in evaluation.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. So yes, and I'm delighted to say we've actually got a whole section on this in the guide and how to involve affected people. The case for doing so is obvious, and I know on the screen it's saying ask the experts. Well, of course, the affected people are the experts in terms of whether our assistance, our humanitarian action was appropriate, whether it was on time, who it reached. And so with the best will in the world, even though agencies will have their own perspectives on that, those perspectives we know from evaluations and research don't always match the perspectives of affected people. So I think the case is very clear about why we need to be doing it. But our record hasn't been brilliant in this respect, and I'm actually wondering how many people online or in the room as evaluators have been asked to do an evaluation when you're given a few days or perhaps a week or maximum 2 weeks to actually talk to affected people. And I mean, at best that can be quite tokenistic. At worst, we're just not hearing from affected people. And the usual reason for that is lack of resources. So often that's the part that's cut if resources are under pressure. So I'd say the first key message is plan for this from the outset. And that means making adequate resources available, make sure you've got evaluators who've got the right skills on the team to do it, and ideally some evaluators who understand the context and perhaps some of the ethical or even protection issues in consulting affected people. And as evaluators, if you feel that inadequate resources have been allocated to this part of the evaluation, the inception phase is the ideal time to challenge that and to point out what is or is not possible to do with the resources available. My second key message here would be consider how to disaggregate the affected population, because of course it's not a homogeneous group. So really think about how different groups have experienced the crisis differently and also the response. So that may be by gender, by age, and again, this is where local contextual knowledge is really important. So in a conflict environment, it might be by ethnicity, it might be by different livelihood group, urban and rural people having different experiences. So consider how to disaggregate the population, and then how can we do better at consulting the affected people, and what methods? Well, actually, in practice, we very often find ourselves using qualitative methods. It's only in the better funded evaluations where you might be able to use a combination of quantitative and qualitative. But very often we're relying on qualitative methods, and these can be very insightful. And then because they're qualitative, it doesn't mean that they're a cop-out by any means. But actually what it does require is, and this would be my third key message, it's usually less people to do them, to carry out that kind of consultation, but higher skill levels. So really strong facilitation skills, and making sure that you're rigorous in designing and implementing your qualitative methods. So I think that's essential. And I was also then going to share a couple of my own experiences, because we're often evaluating, of course, in very challenging contexts, especially conflict contexts. And it's very easy for the case to be made that, oh, it's too difficult, we can't get access to affected people. So I wanted to share with you my one very recent experience in South Sudan in last year, and in Somalia in 2012. These were two evaluations with FAO at the country level, where we actually dedicated part of the evaluation effort to consulting affected people. So in Somalia, just over a month was allocated to doing that. A local team led by an anthropologist looking at the impact of cash for work programs in a part of Somalia. In South Sudan, it was 2 months that were allocated to that, again using qualitative methods, a lot of use of PRA methods. The similarities were using trained teams of national researchers to do that consultation. And in fact, some of the pictures from these exercises kind of have been on the screen, but they were very insightful in making sure that we were hearing back from affected people. In the South Sudan case, the consultation happened before the main team arrived in Juba, so we had some of those findings already that could feed into the evaluation. And I'm really happy to say that in both cases, the findings that came back from that fieldwork were immediately used by the respective FAO offices. So those are two pretty challenging contexts, South Sudan and Somalia, and yet we were able to build in some serious consultation with affected people. It's also important to be clear about what you haven't found out. So there were certain areas that we couldn't visit, so you need to be really careful not to generalize beyond the people and the geographical areas that you've reached. But if you have the commitment, it's amazing what you can do. And I think that's my fourth key message, is it's all about mindset and commitment, because lots of obstacles will be put in your way in terms of consulting the affected people, and it's too easy to just say, it's just too difficult, we can't do it. But if the commitment is there from the evaluation manager, from the agency, from the evaluation team, then I would say with the right resources, it's amazing how much you can do, and it's something we really need to get better at.
Margie, thank you very much. On the question of resources, I have a very probing question here from Emily Hampton-Manley from the UNOIOS, that's operational oversight, is it not, I think? And she says, Margie, and question to you, how do I get the perspectives of the affected population without draining all my resources? You mentioned the word resources.
Absolutely.
So when they're not finite, and Emily hasn't got many, what should she do about it?
Yeah. Okay, and it's a really good question. And I think the first thing is, so John was talking about get clear about your evaluation questions, then get clear about which of those questions require you to consult with the affected people. Because if it's a question about organisational processes, well, that's clearly not one to take to the affected people. But if it's about the appropriateness of the response, then it very clearly is. And this is about prioritising your resources. So if you're serious about listening to people, then that's what you prioritise.
Yeah.
And plan carefully in advance. If you plan it carefully, and if you and I really stress the in advance part, because the kinds of researchers, evaluators who are going to be able to do that are probably not going to be available at a day's notice. And to plan it in some of these challenging environments, it takes time. You need to be very flexible, very creative. So, plan carefully, plan in advance, and prioritise if that's important to the questions you're asking.
Does that resonate with your experience in
Yes, I think so in many ways, actually, because I think this thing about planning in advance maybe also starts with actually the monitoring of the program or project that you then want to evaluate. And maybe that's it's almost a question for Marty and John from me, is this thing about, as I see it from our organization, we do collect an awful lot of information and data from our beneficiaries as monitoring data. And how can we be better at kind of almost recycling that data for evaluation? I think is a key challenge for us, because that's where we put in a lot of resources and where we have an awful lot of data often that maybe are not really utilized to the extent that we could. Of course, you have challenges with the monitoring data maybe not fitting the questions that you want to have answered, but there's still something there, I think, for us to look into and to better utilize.
That's interesting. I have another question from Emily. She's asking very probing questions, and this one I'm going to ask to you, Mikkel, if I may. How do I get a real community member and not just a stakeholder representative to answer these questions? So, how do you do that in your monitoring work?
You get out of the car and into the field. But I think, again, I would say that I do think that we have a lot of engagement with our beneficiaries in our day-to-day work. And a lot of this, of course, there's a lot of data collection as well in our monitoring work. But, to get it into the evaluation exercise, I agree with Marty that, of course, then you need to plan it. But then I also think that it's often something we do, to be honest. And when we do our in DRC our real-time evaluations, we always have site visits and walk around and in that way engage with the beneficiaries. So.
Thank you. Real-time evaluations. What about how does that work for the affected population? Is that a key element when doing real-time evaluations for you?
I think you have less. There's usually less time to consult with the affected population, because the pressure is on delivering your findings very fast. But actually, I just wanted to answer something else in relation to what you were saying earlier. Because I think the other thing that we need to be very wary of, or aware of, is there's a big effort at the moment in the sector to be more accountable to affected people, and which is really important. And again, it's an area that we don't have a great track record, despite lots of nice words and documents coming out over the years. And I think that it's important to realise that evaluation is only part of that. Evaluation is not the best way to be accountable to the affected people. That's something to do. That's much more to do with the ongoing relationship between the organisation and the community. And I really emphasise that word relationship, because it's not just about tools. Being accountable is not just about tools. It's about the kind of relationship you have with the affected people. So evaluation can be a part of that, but it's not the whole answer. And if an organisation has been accountable to affected people, then you should have some quite good knowledge and records that goes back to the monitoring point of actually whether people have been happy with what they've received and whether the organisation has been responsive to feedback that they've had. So you may want to actually invest some time in summarising and pulling that information together before you go to the cost of putting an evaluation team into on the ground.
Yeah, that's very helpful. John, any final thoughts on the affected population issue?
Yeah, we're going to say that there are no real community members. Everyone you talk to has got their own agenda. And if you go there thinking that you're going to talk to people and they're a barrel of knowledge, you're going to open the tap and fill your bucket of knowledge, that doesn't happen. Everybody has an agenda. We know that even in formal surveys, that the answer the surveyor gets depends on the race, age, gender, body shape even of the questioner, so social status. So all of those affect answers even in formal surveys. So it's to be aware that any survey or sort of interview of any kind is an interaction. And so it's not just opening the tap. So just be aware, I would say, of what agendas might be, and to triangulate so that you're getting your answer from more than one type of source and more than one direction.
Well, thank you very much for that, John. We have half an hour left, and so it would be great to get your own views and perspectives. And so I'm going to open up the floor now. I'll take 3 or 4 questions. We'll take them in batches. And could you say who you are and who you're working for? That would be very helpful. Sir, we'll go to you at the back there first. Thank you.